All right, welcome to another episode here or another video for our Writing in AI series. Amped to have this conversation as we're going to spend a little bit of our time today exploring how you might think about emphasizing the action verbs in the standards as it pertains to writing in particular. But really, this is something that could go across content areas. And that by doing so, that creates the space in which we can start to think about where AI meets the work that we get to do with students in the classroom. And so I'm really grateful to Eileen Heller of ESU3 for joining us today, along with Crystal Ernst of ESU2. And before we get too far into it, I want to establish some things and say that it is tough to talk about AI because you're going, hey, are we talking about the reality within which we are operating today? And there's also the future of what could be and the potential that this technology might have on a future version of education that we might even aspire to or disagree about. But trying to find space between those two realities to hold discourse is difficult, which is why we want to do a video. And in addition to that, I think there's always the challenge of saying, hey, local context, what are we doing in our district? What initiatives have we mutually agreed upon and are invested in because we see that need within our student body versus not versus, but maybe sometimes can be a little bit at odds with some of the state standards and some of the things we might talk about that maybe where there is a little bit of a rub between those two that we have to think flexibly and try to be inclusive of both of those. And certainly we would not push anything that would go against either of those pieces. So if our idea sharing here infringes upon that, certainly defer back to your local district and the state standards, of course. But we're going to try to hold some conversations that I think are difficult to have with all that context. And as such, we'll hopefully give some ideas and give you something to think about, those of you in this, as you think about this work for your own classroom, for the teams that you're on in the district that you maybe will be able to be a part of conversations around this topic within. So all that framework around what we're going to talk about, I'm going to throw things over to Eileen to start here as we're going to get into thinking about those action verbs in the standards.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thanks for having me on today. I do a lot of professional learning with educators, and oftentimes the districts are asking me to do professional learning around artificial intelligence because they see the benefit towards not only the teachers, but the students, and they're trying to have someone help kind of go through those murky waters of what would be appropriate, not appropriate. We have many teachers coming in, and it's wide across the board. Those that see a ton of benefit, they really want to start learning more about it and bringing it into the classrooms, all the way to those that are like, I don't want to touch it, I don't trust it, and I don't really want this to be a part of our classroom, and bringing in hot issues and concerns around cheating and those types of things. So the way that I typically will address this is we will look at the standards specifically, and I ask them to start by just looking at the verb of the standard. What does the verb say? Does it say they need to analyze? Do they need to evaluate? Do they need to summarize? Those can be very flexible. And so students can show that in a variety of ways besides writing, in the way that we might consider of writing a composition, an essay, or a multi-paragraph writing piece. So that's one area that we look at. Now, in the standard, sometimes it says something very specific in the verb, like the students will use a recursive writing process. And then we look at the noun to see how do they need to demonstrate that. There's one I looked at 8th grade and then 11th, 12th grade ELA. And one says they will use that recursive writing process to write a multi-paragraph composition. So if they state in their multi-paragraph composition, that tells the teacher that that is the way they have to demonstrate it. And that's critical that teachers understand. The standards are guiding what the teacher needs to teach and hope the students will master, but it does not guide how they will do it in their classrooms. So that important piece is really just understanding what the verb is, look at the nouns, what's firm, where might there be some flexibility. Then they can start talking with their grade level partners, department level partners, bringing clarity to that and kind of expanding their thoughts around what we mean by writing.
So fair enough to say that we're going to emphasize the action verbs and the nouns, which I really appreciate. And you brought up an ELA example there, and we're going to focus on that primarily throughout this series. But certainly, I want to be inclusive of writing in other content areas as well. And so maybe let's go there for a second and say that by contrast, what does it look like maybe in other subject areas where there may or may not be that 5-paragraph essay or multi-paragraph expectation in the standards?
Yeah, that comes up quite often because some of our districts really have seen maybe writing going on a decrease for students. And so they might do like a continuous improvement goal around writing across the content areas. And then we're seeing maybe a science teacher or a social studies teacher who before hadn't really had to develop the writing component around students, but because that's their district goal, then they're having to expand their minds around what might that look like in my classroom. And I think that's where, okay, so I'm going to use the term Monday to someday, and that's a term that I've seen in a couple different places, but my teachers are oftentimes hungry for the what can I bring back Monday? What can I integrate in my classroom right now? But then we also have to think about the someday and the someday of our students, of what is going to be college, career, life skills, the someday of where our district might need to go. So expanding our minds, if a district's saying you need to do writing across the curriculum area, that what might that writing look like? So an example would be a district is currently really looking at that writing across the content area, and they require the science teachers to do a claim, evidence, and reasoning writing piece within the science. Now, looking at the science standards, these are some of the terms: construct a scientific explanation, gather and make sense of information, construct and produce arguments. Those do not say a multi-paragraph composition. But what we're seeing is that the district is asking for a common summative assessment around claim, evidence, and reasoning in a multi-paragraph composition. So the teachers that are looking at those science standards are also feeling like they're writing teachers, and that's a stretch for them. And so a lot of collaboration has to come with the other people on their staff, really understanding how can we make this across subject levels. And for me, it just brings in that awareness of what does writing look like beyond that multi-paragraph composition? So could it be a script for a podcast or a script for a video presentation? Could it be the slide deck and really having to curate those individual bullet points of key information? Could it be in an infographic, visual flow chart, and that the note cards are still doing that recursive writing process where they're brainstorming and they're drafting and they're editing, but it's not locked into a multi-paragraph composition, which would add to not only inclusive learning that we look at for students that might demonstrate their learning in a different way and not be strong with that multi-paragraph composition, but it also allows us to really demonstrate for students the many forms that writing or sharing your thoughts to a specific audience might look like. So that Monday to someday, we really kind of look at what might you be able to use around AI soon and with the current circumstances in your district, but still that great conversation and dissonance that comes of what do someday we envision our students needing, and how can we start having those conversations in our district?
Yeah, because as you talked about there with the claim evidence and reasoning, the demonstration of that could be in a myriad of different, what they call it, products or representations of learning. And so love the vision there. And Crystal, I think that kind of gets us to a place where we're hoping for you to speak to a little bit, and certainly both can jump in as it makes sense here. But where we start to say, okay, well, if those are our standards, if those are our objectives, what then allows for us to have that acceptable AI use? Because I can see it right from the example that Eileen just shared there as I go, okay, well, but can the AI create the claim? Well, probably. Well, how can it support it then? Does that mean that it can help me edit once I've put this together, perhaps? And those are the kind of conversations that we can walk up to in this video, but we'll get into more depth over the course of this resource. So I'm going to kick things over to Crystal here to talk a little bit about how we can use standards and objectives to determine acceptable AI use So go ahead, Crystal. Yeah, thanks.
Eileen did a great job mentioning too, like there's so many ways for students to demonstrate what they know that don't have to be writing centered. And we tend to go to writing as our main form of communication because that's what we've always done. But as we start to think about, and Eileen mentioned the someday piece of what students are going to be asked to do, literacy has a lot of different pillars. And so it's listening and speaking and reading and writing. And to combine all of those to communicate is really what we want them to do when they write. And so how can AI help them with more brevity in what they're saying, with better quality? And we have to remember that other countries have access to AI as well, and they're using them in their classrooms. So our students in the someday are going to be asked to compete on a global level with other people who know how to use AI to really produce good products. So how can we show them to communicate their ideas, but use AI to better that? So when we look at the standards, Andrew, would you show up that matrix quick? There are different ways that AI can assist besides just giving us a final product, which I think sometimes as an English teacher, when I'm concerned about cheating, I go right to, well, the kids are going to have the AI write it for them. But instead, there's different levels of AI assistance that students can use to offset some of that cognitive load so they can focus on what they should be achieving in the classroom. So like if we look at that level 2 of what Andrew has up, sometimes students struggle to come up with the idea. So even like when Eileen was talking about the science example, they have to cite evidence. Well, they might just need to narrow down exactly what evidence they need to look at, and AI could assist them by giving them some ideas. So that's going to help jumpstart them into producing some really high quality work instead of them spending the time and just wallowing through ideas. But then we could go all the way to their side as AI as a co-creator and start to talk about, Eileen said, giving a podcast. So if students feed the AI generator with all of the things they want to talk about, AI could make the podcast script for them. But then another piece of that when we're producing on that level is the student has to think about their mood and tone, the intro like you had for our video, which was so excellent. That really sets that tone. So they can start to think about how to craft that final product and not worry about the script. So it just offsets some pieces of that cognitive load so they can focus on that product and that communication piece.
This is a really great resource that you can access here. Thank you to Washington State for putting this together. And it's something that we certainly learned from and reference later on in our video series coming up. And so, yeah, great examples with that. And in what limited time we have here, I guess, yeah, what have we left out or what do we need to address in this conversation that we haven't?
I think just going back to Eileen really talked about finding that verb and the noun and knowing that's the non-negotiable. So that's what I have to do. But all the pieces that lead up to that are things that the AI can assist the student with so they can focus on that non-negotiable. So that makes the classroom so much more inclusive and accessible for some of our students when we can offset some of that load and struggle so that they can perform at that high classroom level standards-based rigor.
And I'll say in connection to Crystal's matrix that she was referencing, there's that level 1 of no AI assistant. And a question I'll often pose to the educators in the room is what might be a result if we never expose our students to AI through their education K-12, and what might be the result if we do. And it always comes up with 2 things. It's not equitable if we don't, because it's going to be more inclusive when we are allowing students to sometimes use that, plus putting them in a space in the world where they're prepared and ready. And that's the other piece is if we don't, will they be ready for, they're living in the real world now, but we want them college, career, and life ready. And that is going to be a part of that life. So when I pose those questions, it brings about the reasoning behind it. It's just a lot of teachers might stay in that, nope, I'm not going to even allow it because they have the concern. What would it look like? What would it sound like? What would be appropriate? So we have to start with that base level for teachers that are hesitant around it.
Yes, and that's why we have a why video as a part of this series, because that is so critical for students to be able to, that we have the teacher clarity piece in place enough that students understand what they should expect to get out of this, and that maybe we're not replicating this as how they would go about doing that in the workplace in its entirety, because we're sort of taking the tech out of their hands for certain steps to ensure that they have the capacity within them, the skills, the knowledge base to be able to work with the technology. And so it doesn't have to replicate the future work process necessarily. But I think you can kind of serve both ambitions there, Eileen, at the same time. And so we're not talking out both sides of our mouth. We're saying it's sort of an and it's going to be an interesting process by which we go about arriving at this, that we're hopeful to continue to create more content and have conversations around. If you want to talk with some great folks like this that I get to hang out with all the time, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to your local ESU. We got awesome folks across Nebraska who are very thoughtful in support of this effort. And if you're looking for more resources, we have the resource that you may be accessing this through or not, but this is our collection that we've been referencing over the course of today's conversation. And I'm going to bring things to a close by just saying thank you so very much to Eileen and Crystal for your time, for being a thought partner in this work. And it would just encourage folks to continue to look for the additional content that we're adding around this, as we've referenced multiple times, because this is all part of what we need to be thinking about as we try to support students in this era of writing and AI.